everyone, and warm welcome to the latest Women's Empowerment Leadership and Diversity Chapter webinar. As Nicole said, my name is Maura Hudson. I'm Senior Managing Director for Newmark Knight Frank's Global Corporate Services outsourcing business. I'm also a chapter co-chair among a wonderful team, a very engaged team of 10 other members of our chair committee, representing key roles in a wide variety of outsourcing industries. A little bit about our chapter. It's designed to promote discussion amongst our membership on how outsourcing and the leaders of this important sector can leverage this powerful platform for the promotion of greater gender diversity. This chapter also speaks to inclusive practices that strengthens what indeed makes us unique, including race, color, ethnicity, language, nationality, sexual orientation, religion, social economic status, age, and physical and mental ability. Today's chapter discussion starts, or in many cases continues, a dialogue around questions many are asking in boardrooms and among community leaders today. What should organizations, or why should organizations empower diverse leaders? What do they get out of it? How do they measure the success? Is it a straightforward financial measure? Is it productivity, a hiring value? And how are diverse leaders cultivated? How are they empowered to build up future leadership? And finally, what are the pitfalls to avoid and key criteria to success? We are fortunate to have Mary Lewis, a longtime member, educator, and strategic committee leader of IAOP, moderate this complex discussion today. In addition to IAOP, she also serves as a supply chain leader for Sprint. Mary, I am pleased to hand this mic over to you to kick us off and also introduce our esteemed panel. Mary.
Thank you, Maura. Welcome, everybody. You know, this is a very timely topic because according to a Boston Consulting Group report, it was published earlier this year, the increasing diversity of leadership teams leads to more and better innovation and improved financial performance. So this is the case not only for developing economies, but developed economies as well. And there's a bigger payoff from innovation and EBIT margin. So clearly, diversity is great. And the more diverse an organization is, the payoff is it's incredible. But with the diversity and empowerment present in the dialogue of nearly every segment of society, today's topic is especially timely because if you recall, the recent elections in the United States featured the most diverse slate of candidates ever. On a personal note, I live in Kansas and we're sending our very first female Native American to Congress. So with respect to the commercial sector though, diversity has been a philosophy and a practice for several decades. Certainly, many people who are on the webinar are aware of this and it's very visible. But interestingly, in 2016, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review and it had a very interesting title called Why Diversity Programs Fail. And the authors Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kalev point out not to the diversity policies themselves, but management behaviors as moving the needle on empowering women and diverse candidates. So it's not the programs, it's what you do individually as leaders. So this came from analyzing about 3 decades worth of data from more than 800 firms. So for today's webinar, the question that is on top of mind is, what is the impact when the executives are diverse? And is there something we can learn by how those diverse executives empower others? So to answer that question, we've got 2 leaders with tech industry experience with well-respected and recognized firms. Frenchie Green is an experienced sourcing and procurement executive, and she's worked at both Microsoft and Facebook. Ken Kundus is the Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer of Financial Services for Capgemini. So what I'd like to do is I'd like the panelists to share their backgrounds along with a personal view of their own career journey. Frenchie, let's start with you.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to everyone for attending the webinar today. My background is interesting. I fell into procurement, literally. I think when I started my career journey, there wasn't a formal program for procurement, and it wasn't being encouraged as a profession. My first role was actually at Target Corp. I'm from Minnesota. I worked in the buying office at Target Corp. And interestingly enough, during that time, Bill Clinton had signed an agreement with all of the automotive manufacturers to say that they would do more around supplier diversity, that they would increase the number of diverse suppliers that they were buying automotive products from. So I ended up working for an automotive manufacturer in the inner city in what was then called a hub zone. It was a partnership between a company out of Farmington Hills, Michigan, and a company, a minority-owned manufacturer in Minnesota. And I honestly have to say that was the first opportunity that I had to really be given stretch roles, the opportunities to take risks, roles where I had little experience, but they had the confidence in my capabilities that I could do the work. I ended up being the head of sourcing, production control, master scheduling, incoming inspection, shipping and receiving, which was pretty important at a company that was providing automotive parts to Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. So I actually have that company to really thank for giving me the confidence to expand my horizons and feel that I could go after opportunities that I felt may in the past have been things that I normally would not apply for. That brought me to Microsoft, where I led their global e-sourcing program and eventually their outsourced source-to-pay model for a number of years, and finally to Facebook, where I led the outsourced source-to-pay model and processes. Ken?
Yeah, thank you so much. So my name is Ken Kundus, and I am the Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer at Capgemini. For those of you who don't know about Capgemini, we are a systems integrator and consulting firm based in Paris, France. And yes, I do get to go there on a regular basis, which is a lovely perk of the job. We have about 200,000 employees worldwide, with a strong concentration in India, of course. The financial services division for which I work is about 60,000 employees, 61,000 employees globally, and we're about a $3.5 billion business. Currently, I manage a diverse workforce, to say the least. So I've got people who are in the US, people who are in France, and people who are in India. In marketing, of course, traditionally, I wouldn't say a woman-dominated field, but certainly there's a strong representation of women in the organization, and roughly half of my employees are women. It's funny, Frenchie had said that she kind of stumbled into procurement. I stumbled into technology. I think the stumble is sort of what we all do. I mean, we all attempt to plan things, but opportunity doesn't necessarily listen. And I began my career right out of graduate school working for a software company in Orlando, Florida, and spent the majority of my career up until about 6 years ago in Orlando, Florida, working at a series of financial services software companies, which for some reason were in abundance in the greater Central Florida area. And in terms of my diversity trajectory or path, if you will, journey, working for American-based software companies that were only really marketing in the United States. I worked for a company called Fiserv, which was very much focused on the community bank market. And as a gay man, I will tell you that was something of a challenge. I didn't really understand how different a life could be outside of that until I moved to Infosys, which of course I think most people who are affiliated with the outsourcing industry know, where I was the head of US marketing for a product called Finacle, which is the core banking application, one of the very few products that Infosys actually sold. But it availed me to an entirely different dimension and an entirely different metaphor for business and for life. Obviously, I got a much broader view of the world, and that really increased my understanding of what diversity really meant, and the value of diversity, not only in terms of gender or sexual orientation, but also just in terms of culture and nationality. And really slowly having to learn bit by bit as I manage these global staffs on how to adjust my approach based on the culture. So that has been something that has been a journey for me. And it definitely has made me a better person, I hope a better human being, and certainly a better business person. So that's kind of my trajectory. Mary?
Thanks, Ken and Frenchie. Your backgrounds are very inspiring. Both of you talked about stumbling into technology. I am a happy accident of stumbling into supply chain, certainly technology. My career started out in the Army, and talk about being outnumbered. I was the lone woman in a whole organization of men, and so everything ended up being an uphill battle. But I learned a lot from that. So for insight, let's go back to some of the research on diversity training programs. Now, as I mentioned earlier, almost all Fortune 500 companies are using diversity training. But if the training message is negative, and again, if the training message is negative, where they emphasize either litigation or satisfy a check-the-box compliance program, for example, the effects can be adverse. And I think as many companies might start out, they have a diversity program that could be precipitated, as in Sprint's situation where I work, we became a supplier of the U.S. government. And so there was an expectation that we would have supplier diversity and a more diverse workforce. And so some of the compliance programs ended up being check the box. So some organizations, though, are getting it right. They're doing a great job developing diverse leaders. So what I'd like to hear from the panelists, I'd like to hear you guys comment on how you've seen diverse leaders cultivated, whether in your current company or other firms, and how are they empowered to build future leadership? So what's worked, and share some success stories. And we'd also like to hear, how do you measure success? So Ken, why don't you take the first stab at this?
Sure, absolutely. So, at Capgemini, I think, I've worked for a number of large companies throughout the course of my career. Obviously, Fiserv is a Fortune 500 company. I also worked for BNY Mellon, which is a sort of a good old American company from a long ago. And then, of course, some global companies. Infosys, I worked for a boutique SI called Mindtree for a while that has about 33,000 employees. And I've also, of course, I'm now at Capgemini. And I do have to say that in the score of diversity, Capgemini would certainly lead the way. And I think part of it is the foundational principle of being an entrepreneurial company, and that if you succeed and you're good at the work that you do, you will advance. So I think there's just a baseline culture that is a little bit more sort of colorblind and gender blind, because it's a very hard driving organization. And if you can drive as hard as everybody else, I don't think anyone's really going to pay attention. So there is that baseline. But there also is, I think, a number of very important things that we do. And one of the things that Capgemini is known for is its thought leadership. So we do try to create thought leadership platforms for women. We have a regular webinar program that's called Women in Digital that we host. There are, for financial services, there are Women in Banking webinars and events that we run to try to cultivate not only interest from women in our programs, but also to allow women within the organization to tell their story and to really be part of that storytelling that we do. I mean, I think it's very easy to have policies and you have affinity groups, et cetera. I said, but I think when it can be made more three-dimensional, it is something that is much more compelling. And as an outsourcing company, recruitment is the most important thing. So, diversity is really part of the fabric of our recruitment because it needs to be, not simply to target certain numbers or thresholds of number of women in leadership positions, but simply as an avenue to get talented people in the door. And I think that, you know, every outsourcing company, I'm not sure if there are other people who work in the industry on the phone, but that is our biggest challenge, is getting quality talent that is scalable. So it really, diversity across the board, not just for women, but for South Asians, obviously, for ethnicities, for sexual orientation. Those things are all really hallmarks of our larger sort of recruitment strategy.
So Ken, you mentioned something about, you know, your thought leadership programs and, you know, cultivating a diverse base, allowing women to tell their stories. Can you share maybe a success story, whether it was somebody who reported either to you or someone that you've helped mentor?
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, there was a young woman in when I was in Mindtree, there was a young woman in our London office, and unfortunately, a lot of the what we call Indian pure plays don't really have the best record when it comes to diversity in senior management. But she was someone who I immediately identified as kind of a marketing superstar, and I don't pass that out lightly. She was someone who had both the breadth and depth of marketing knowledge. She was a writer, which is always something that's important. And so, you know, what we did with her is, but she was fairly junior, but what we did with her is we did put her into our mentor program with one of the other, with the most senior female executive, who really created in her, you know, a sense of understanding of what the trajectory was like in for a woman in that industry. I can't provide that because I can be sympathetic, but I can't be empathetic in that situation because I have a different set of experiences. So pairing her with someone who is, you know, kind of a couple, maybe a generation ahead of her, was really the way that we kind of groomed her. You know, I groomed her from a marketing side, and then, you know, from the executive aside, the female executive did that. So I can report I've been gone from the company now for about a year and a half, and she's now the CMO of Europe for the company. So so I think that was probably a big success that I felt I contributed to, and she's also one of my favorite people. So obviously I'm personally happy for her as well.
Wow, that is truly inspiring. And it's a great example of how understanding, I like what you said when you said you can be sympathetic but not empathetic because you don't have that same perspective. And I think that's very significant because sometimes people are just sort of assigned a mentor, and it's kind of like either speed dating or blind dating, and you're kind of, that's it. That's who they end up working with. And it may not be as successful. So Frenchie, what do you have to add to this? Can you share some success stories and how you have either seen or how you've empowered that future leader pipeline?
I can. And Mary, thanks. You know, you mentioned earlier that it's not just checking a box. And that's where most companies tend to go wrong. There has to be a compelling business case and an understanding that diversity matters because you need to reflect your customer base in your employee base. It's so important. That's what drives me. Whether I'm at Facebook, Microsoft, those are global companies that have customers around the world, and we need to make sure that we reflect our customer base. That's the only way that we can differentiate ourselves and really bring the right products to market. So I do think that, as you've mentioned, when companies talk about it's important and it's for social good, that is not the reason. It's not compelling enough to ensure that employees are on board with the program. They need to understand that it impacts the bottom line of the company. Now, I want to talk about recruitment and then retention, because those are two areas where companies either succeed or they fail. When I think about recruitment, it's so important that there is a diverse candidate slate. From the time you start screening candidates, there has to be a pretty significant pool of candidates to interview. Just think about starting with screening candidates and then getting down to the final number of candidates that you're going to interview. If you only start with 1 or 2 diverse candidates, what's the likelihood that those 1 or 2 candidates are going to make it all the way through the screening process down to face-to-face interviews? So I would say really challenging your recruiting team, your sourcing team, to make sure that they are bringing forth a volume of qualified candidates during the screening process so that you can pick and choose who you think should move on to the next phase. It's at that point, it really is a numbers game and making sure you have enough volume to support finding candidates that would move into interview. Process, having someone there, either yourself or someone on the team that is responsible for challenging what I would call and what's known as unconscious bias. A perfect example of that is this person is not a cultural fit. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that in interview feedback. Really challenging people to go back and describe what that means. What are the attributes that this person exhibited that would demonstrate that they're not a cultural fit, as opposed to just saying this candidate is not a cultural fit. So it's getting to the bottom of and rooting out unconscious bias during the interview process. Then I want to talk about retention, because it's not enough to just recruit and hire. You've got to retain them. Being out on the West Coast and recruiting someone from the East Coast where they've been in a very diverse environment, it's so important to make sure that people feel comfortable where they are. Ken mentioned affinity groups. Also, there are different groups that have events each year that give employees a voice to really be open and talk about what they're experiencing and how they're feeling about working at a particular company, as well as having a mentor is so important. I can't stress that enough. It was interesting when I was at Facebook, percentage-wise, I probably had the most diverse team. I really pushed recruiting to find diverse candidates for me. So I had an Asian woman, I had a white male, I had 2 Latinas, and then I had 3 African Americans, including myself, on my direct report staff. It's so important as a leader. You have to be the one to push recruiting for a diverse candidate slate and challenge them to make sure that they're finding the right talent for you. And once they're there, providing stretch opportunities for them so they feel like they're continuing to grow and develop as well is super important to me.
So Frenchie, it sounds like you've had a really, oh, I'm hearing some feedback. Some really good experience with diverse teams. Can you share maybe some success stories about, 1 or more of those candidates? How have you mentored, and what did you see as a result of your involvement and your making sure that the diversity was as robust as possible?
Sure. So I actually had a gentleman that I recruited from North Carolina. Again, he was on the East Coast, very senior in the role that he was at the company that he worked for. I recruited him here to the Bay Area. Super sharp. I knew that I had to continue to develop him. I had to keep him on a trajectory of learning and growth in order for him to want to stay and feel like it was worth moving his family almost 3,000 miles to the Bay Area. So I assigned him some of the most complicated stakeholders in our business. And I also assigned him to a few projects that I thought were stretch opportunities for him. But I also made sure that I gave him the right coaching as a manager and let him feel like he could come to me and talk to me about truly what his challenges were, and then made sure that he had a mentor so that he had someone outside of my purview to give him a company perspective as well as he was working on these projects. I actually, at that point, he was so successful, I ended up recommending that he be one of my peers. I really felt strongly that he was ready for promotion. And I went to my SVP and said, we need to promote him. If we're going to keep him, we need to promote him. I don't know how often that happens. It certainly never happened to me, but I felt strongly that in order to retain him, we really needed to promote him. And we ended up promoting him to senior director, gave him the scope for EMEA, and he became one of my peers. So that's probably one of my proudest moments.
Frenchie, you mentioned a couple of really interesting things, and the first one is on the recruitment. Now, having been a hiring manager, quite frankly, I've always looked to HR like, you know, whoever applied and whoever came in, that was the base. And so I think my lesson learned would be, you know, I can and should push back so that I can get as diverse a candidate pool as possible, because you're right, it is a numbers game. So that is very key, and I think that I will do that the next time I have a job opening. The second item you talked about is promoting somebody to a peer, and you know, a wise person once told me, it was actually a mentor, once told me, Mary, never hire anybody you wouldn't want to work for. And the last decision I make before I say yes or no is, would I want to work for this person? Because we can't tell where they're going to end up, we can't tell where we are going to end up. And if we do our job correctly as a leader, they should be our peers or even moving past us. So with that, what I'd like to do is open up the first polling question. So we've heard from the executives today about how they've been empowered and what they've done to empower other and future diverse leaders and advance diversity. So let's hear from our audience. So okay, there we go. So thanks, Nicole. So the polling question is, to what degree does your organization actively empower diversity? Now, this is one where you can, you choose only one. So it's to a great extent, somewhat, not that much, or I don't know. So go ahead and select your response and make sure you hit the submit button, and then we'll see what the results show. All right, I just submitted mine. I'm on a smartphone, and it worked great. So Nicole, once you see somewhat of a representative response, go ahead and share, and hopefully I'll be able to see that. All right. All right, do we have the results? Oh, wow. Okay, so basically the audience is saying that their organizations actively do a lot to empower diversity. So more than half to a great extent, and maybe a little bit close to a third somewhat, and below 20%, so 17, almost 18%. Are saying not that much. So there's where we have room for improvement. But I like the fact that the great extent shows that this is an important topic, and certainly as companies start targeting better, candidates, and they're becoming more challenging to fill positions, I think you're going to have to look very broadly and ensure that diversity is a factor. So with that, what I'd like to do is hear from our panelists about success factors. They've also weighed in on the level of empowerment that they personally have experienced. But sometimes the lessons learned are from things that may not have gone as well as we had hoped that they would go. So what I'd like to do is, how can we gain some insight about some of the pitfalls to avoid? So, Ken, what are some of your ahas and your thoughts on pitfalls to avoid?
Yeah, I think the thing that I think makes us all a little bit nervous about diversity programs, and this is about diversity programs throughout history, is changing one unlevel playing field to another. And one of the situations that I've actually seen here at Capgemini is that on a couple of occasions, someone, a particular executive has been promoted, a female executive has been promoted, and I actually heard that person's manager say, I know she's not that great, but we don't have a lot of women managers. And I think that for any diversity group, that is a very slippery slope, because what that implies is that you don't have to have, you don't have to be particularly talented as long as you're a woman, or as long as you're a gay man, or as long as you're an African American, et cetera. So I think that, and what that does, I think, is it sends the exact opposite message to your workforce than what you want to send. It actually does the cause, if you will, damage by promoting unqualified people into roles simply because of their gender or sexual orientation or whatever. So that, to me, is really the most painful, the most critical, the most damaging pitfall, I think, that you have to be careful of. Now, in the correction of an unlevel playing field, certain things need to be revalved and rethought. But I think we all know that it doesn't need to come at the expense of the quality of the person in that role. I think that, certainly I have never experienced that. I think that, women or men are better at one thing or another. I mean, I think that everyone's an individual, and I think if you take everyone as an individual and you really judge them on their merits, the distribution should take care of itself.
Okay, that very interesting on that, Ken. I came away with some real interesting ideas on that, and I think one of the things that you mentioned about not only just looking at the playing field, or just looking at the how did you say, we need the numbers, and so you don't need to be that talented. Sometimes you can have an individual move from one demographic to another. For example, in my personal case, I was in a very male-dominated organization. Can't get any more male-dominated than the U.S. Army. And so being female there was, a bit of a challenge. Then when I went into the commercial sector, I tended toward the technical roles where there was still a lot of males versus the female involvement. Now, as I'm advancing in my career, I find that gender is less a differentiator than my age. And so now you in and out of biases as a result of a diversity factor that you may not have taken into account from before. So, Frenchie, what about you? What are some of your lessons learned? They could be personal, or they could be things that you've seen, either others have experienced or seen in a company.
I think as a leader, I've felt more empowered to have a voice that I probably did not have earlier in my career. So I feel a lot more comfortable about challenging and thoughtfully questioning the candidate interview slate. I feel much more empowered to push when I feel that there is an employee and diverse employee. I've had this experience where I've had a diverse employee that has been solidly performing. And how do you evaluate side by side, especially when you get into the calibration discussion with your peers, what's impactful employee to employee? And so I've felt a lot more empowered and comfortable in really pushing, knowing that myself as a woman and a woman of color, the stats are there. It shows that it takes us 5 to 10 years longer to get to the same level that our peers are at. The stats show that we're not paid, and women are not paid at the same level that men are paid. These are known facts. And so I feel much more comfortable and empowered as a leader to really push when I see things that are inequitable. And the nice thing is that I have been able to go to HR at times and say, look, here's what I'm seeing. Here's what should be happening. This employee should be promoted. Here is how they stack up against all the competencies for the role. And here is the business reason why they should be promoted. I felt much more comfortable doing that and getting a positive response from HR such that they would sit in the room during calibration and work with me behind the scenes to make sure that employees are being fairly evaluated. So I would say as a manager and as a leader, feeling comfortable, but making sure you've got all your ducks in a row when you're trying to justify a hire or you're trying to justify promotion for employees, in particular employees of color. When I think about metrics, I think really in order to be successful, the metrics have to go down to the manager level. Anyone that is responsible for hiring employees, it's table stakes that they should be qualified for the role. But managers need to start being challenged, especially in tech. I mean, I've been in tech since 2004. Managers really have to start to be challenged on why they're not hiring diverse candidates.
So it sounds like, Frenchie, I like the comment that you made about the metrics going down to manager level. And that sounds like if a company is transparent, it promotes accountability. So either Ken or Frenchie, like, what are some of the ways that management can be transparent, and what did you see as a result? Did you see, you know, maybe it was a if not a policy change, maybe holding each other accountable? Can you describe what transparency looks like and how that started moving the needle?
You know, I can take that one quickly, and I'm sure Frenchie has a unique point of view about this as well. I mean, I think that I was very struck by what Frenchie just said, which was, you know, this idea that you know, it needs to go down to the manager level, and that it needs to, you know, really kind of permeate throughout, and really having the confidence in your place in your career to stand behind those things. Because I can tell you that, you know, as a gay man, even as an out gay man, sort of very young in my career, I did lack that confidence. I certainly thought everyone was kind of whispering behind my back, and I got to a part where I just didn't care if they were whispering behind my back any longer. So I think that, you know, the idea about you know, having the strength of character to do the right thing, I think is the foundational component. But I will also say that I know I've been very lucky in sort of the era in which I live, because our culture has changed massively, even in just the last 15 years, in terms of acceptance of a lot of different things. And so I think that, you know, can I codify what transparency looks like? No, but I certainly can codify or identify what tolerance looks like, and what acceptance looks like. And I found it very interesting. I've said this many times that that much to my surprise, you know, my status, you know, as a minority, has mattered far less to Indian companies than it did to American companies. I don't know if I went back to those American companies these days if I'd have the same experience. I'm guessing, and certainly hoping, not. But you know, to ask what transparency looks like, I think, I mean, I can't separate that from the cultural shifts that have happened.
Wow. Again, very, very impactful answers and commentary. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to come up with our second poll question. We were talking a lot about, you know, what companies are doing. I'd like to hear from the folks on the webinar how they are the most involved in their organization's efforts to promote diversity and empowerment. Now, this is a response that you can click however many of the buttons that you want So go ahead and put up our poll question. And the question is, how are you most involved in your organization's efforts to promote diversity and empowerment? You could be in a mentoring program, either as a mentor or protege. You could be involved in your recruiting efforts. Doesn't even need to be formal. It could be just college night, you know, somebody from your company going back to a networking event. Maybe you've got a self-managed work team that's diverse and cross-functional. You could be a member of an ERG. I know at Sprint we have several ERGs and I'm on every one of them. You could have networking events at work, or you know, maybe you're not involved in any of them. So go ahead and click any and all of the buttons that you'd like, and we'll hear back in just a minute. Ken, you mentioned something about feeling empowered, and I think, Frenchie, you mentioned something about feeling empowered. Again, I'll go back to my personal note. Just because I felt empowered doesn't mean I was empowered, and that was a big lesson for me to learn. And the example I'd like to share is that I was always envious that when some people brought up ideas in meetings, they seemed to really get support and they looked great. And then I found out that their secret is that they worked individually with the members or whoever was going to be at the meeting separately in advance, so that there were no questions, if you will, or no misgivings at the meeting. There was no surprise. So that was a personal takeaway that I learned the hard way. So, and I still use that today. Oh my goodness. Okay, so the results, wow, this is great. More than 80% of you said that you're on a diverse cross-functional team, and that's whether it's a work team or a project team. Half of you take advantage of an employee resource group or affinity group. Just a little over a third are in a mentoring program. And some of you do networking events at work. I guess the positive thing is that the last one, I'm not involved in any. Nobody selected that, so that's good. There's some involvement everywhere. I'll go back to, so go ahead. Thank you. You can go ahead and change back to the other slide. The thing about the Harvard Business Review study that I was talking about a little earlier is that mentoring is absolutely crucial. It's one of the most successful ways we can get people exposed to each other. We can get cross-functional teams. When you work with people from diverse backgrounds, that alone causes a lot of biases to break down, because you understand people, you're all pulling together as a team, and you're working on a common project or common objective. And so that's very encouraging that people are involved in something, and that's good. So one of the last things I'd like to do is to ask our panelists, what can individuals do? We heard about companies, we've heard about programs, we've heard about leaders, but what can individuals do? How can they, if there aren't a lot of programs, or maybe the programs aren't as effective as they could be, I'm a big believer in individuals taking charge of their career. So what advice would you give to individuals? And Frenchie, I'll go ahead and start with you, and then Ken, you can chime in.
Sure. Mary, I would say individually, making sure that you have a mentor and that you have a sponsor wherever you are working. And those are two different things. A mentor is someone that you go to for advice, for coaching. A sponsor is someone that is advocating for you and advocating for your career growth at that company. It's so important. Sponsor is usually someone that is at a very senior level in the company. They might be vice president, corporate vice president, but it's someone very senior that knows you, knows the work that you're doing, and is able to advocate for your career. I think that is super important on an individual level. With regards to supporting diversity within the company where you are, asking to be a champion for supplier diversity or employee diversity within your business group. Those roles exist. They're not always talked about or advertised, but I think seeking out the senior leadership within your organization and saying that you would like to be a champion for one of those two activities is certainly something that could help contribute significantly to improving the diversity numbers within your corporation. So I would recommend those two things.
All right, Ken, what's your input? What would you advise?
Yeah, Frenchie stole my answer. But what I would say in addition to what she said, because I do think she's right on the money, is just to be present, just to be engaged. I think so often, people have the best of intentions regarding these things, but life intercedes, and sometimes we don't prioritize these things. But by prioritizing them, I think that you're creating a more positive and inclusive workspace or workplace. So I think that something as simple as just truly being engaged and present and understand its importance will drive you to the right decision.
Okay. We've gotten a question in, and what I'd like to do is to share the question, and either of you can take a stab at this, and I'll just read the question as it is. Around the issue of confidence, this individual's curious as to whether you think that the pay inequity is primarily a workplace or an industry-driven issue, or do you think part of the pay gap is driven by the lack of confidence of women relative to how they value themselves and their contributions? Wow, so let's unpack that a little bit. One has to do with, is it an industry or workplace issue, or is it something where the women might lack the confidence to negotiate on their own behalf? So,
Frenchie, I'm going to leave that one to you.
Okay.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that having worked in tech, it's known, it's published that there is a gender gap with regards to pay. That's known. It's out there written publicly. I do think, and it's interesting, Satya, the CEO of Microsoft, at a conference was asked that question, and his thoughts probably did not come out in the way that he wanted to articulate them. But I do think that women are beginning to feel much more empowered to sit down and talk about their accomplishments, what they've achieved, what their impact has been, and to ask for a raise. I think in the past that may not have been the case, but I think certainly with the millennials, my experience has been that they have no problem asking about career growth and asking about pay and what's next for them. So I would say in the past, women may not have felt as empowered and open to talk about those things, but I do see that changing.
I agree. I think now that there's so many more resources that everyone, not just women, but everyone has access to, internet, various studies, organizations. And Frenchie, you got a shout out for your story about sponsorship for your senior director. I would also look to the mentors if an individual has a mentor, I think they need to feel comfortable asking those mentors, maybe give them some guidance in how to negotiate, how to frame up the ask, if you will, because sometimes it's less about feeling confidence as much as it is understanding what's valued and how to reflect and share and message that you've got all those values, all of the attributes that are important. And then on a separate note, I recommend looking at Glassdoor. Glassdoor has a lot of interesting commentary. You could do it at a company level. And what I find is interesting as well is take a look at Glassdoor for your own company and see what's being said. So you can tell whether it's whether it's positive, whether it's accurate or not so accurate, but at least it gives you a perspective. And then certainly as much information as possible, understanding what is valued, what behaviors are valued, what experience is valued, and don't be afraid to negotiate. Here's the plug for IAOP, the Women Empowerment and Diversity chapter. That these are things that not only are we looking at, but in the body of knowledge, we've got past articles and blogs and things like that, past conference proceedings on gender differences in negotiating, for example. So we're coming up kind of to the close here. I wanted to make sure that we got everybody's question answered. So I don't know if there's any more. Hang on a second. There should be another. All right. This is okay. So all right, so here's a comment. Mary, this is both, and you have presented statistics to show that women accept lower levels of pay and their negotiation skills with regard to pay is not as strong as men. Yep, that's true. Women do not negotiate as much as men. Men are actually 4 more times more likely to negotiate their salary than women. These are statistics that you can find more information on. A book called Women Don't Ask, and it's by Linda Babcock. So that's a great reference, and certainly we can continue on with the conversation. What I'd like to do is to hand control of the webinar over to Chitra to do a final wrap-up.
Oh, thank you, Mary. And I really want to thank our wonderful panelists, Frenchie Green and Ken Kundus. Thank you again for an amazing webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chitra Rajeshwari, and I'm the lead chair for the Women Empowerment, Diversity and Leadership chapter. I'm really honored to be part of this amazing chapter with absolutely brilliant-minded other co-chairs. For me, this conversation was just fantastic. There were so many aha moments for me, especially listening to your personal experience with regards to your sponsorship, mentorship story of candidates either growing and developing into senior positions within Capgemini, or Frenchie Green talking about somebody being her peer today. Also what was interesting was to hear about how conversations can definitely change when it comes from top down and when they take a personal interest. And that really has a ripple effect within the organization. Listening to unconscious bias, which was fantastic. Of course, we all heard about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship and how each of those add value to the conversation. So I think there was a lot for us. There's a lot that we learned. It was start to a very crucial conversation. Like I mentioned, we learned about a few other things. Was similar to mentoring is a buddy system to share ideas and build skills across in new ways. If you don't have any expertise within your organization, then look for an outsourced provider that can provide some insight for you. And then most important of all is, for us is to see how we can take this conversation within our own organization. It is important that these discussions continue. I would really like you all I want to challenge each one of you and to take this conversation within your organization, make sure that some of these changes, some of these are implemented within the organization. And also, if you don't see change happening, be the voice, be the change that you want to see. Talk about it, put a group together, bring it to your leadership and say this is what you're hoping to achieve out of this kind of, with this change. Like Sheryl Sandberg says in her book, Lean In, don't wait for permission. You don't need it. You can't take charge because we know what we need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw out a challenge to our audience. 2019 OWS conference is around the corner. It's coming up in February. What we would like to know is, having listened to the conversation today, we want to see what kind of implementation you would you would have within your organization that you can bring excuse me, to the conference so that we can learn more and understand how this webinar has affected each of you within your organization. And then, of course, excuse me, you can continue to learn more about the Women's Empowerment Chapter by going to the IAOP website. You can join us on LinkedIn. Like Nicole mentioned, this conversation is recorded and it'll be housed under the Knowledge Center. So once again, I want to say thank you so much for everybody who participated, and most importantly to Mary for moderating a phenomenal conversation here, an important discussion. And thank you once again to Frenchie Green and Ken Kundus. Thank you, Nicole, for putting this together for us from IAOP. And Mara, thank you so much for your contribution as well. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Chitra.
Everyone.